The discussion got heated in this very studio last week when we asked about the French president commemorating the bicentenary of the death of Napoleon. Napoleon, a reformer, but also a tyrant who restored slavery. This Monday, the same Emmanuel Macron taking part in ceremonies for the 15th annual National Day of Commemoration of Enslavement and its abolition. We'll ask about the civics and the politics of remembrance, particularly when a nation is 1 year out from a presidential election, and Macron's main rival from the far right clamors against so-called political correctness. But it's about more than how a nation deals with its past and its identity. Slavery, indentured service, still exists today. They've adapted surprisingly well to globalization. The migrant crisis revealing roots and networks of human trafficking. How are we unwittingly contributing to the enslavement of others, and what can be done to stop it? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at slavery then and now. Joining us from Stamford, Connecticut, Grégory Pierrot, Associate Professor of English at the University of Connecticut and the author of The Black Avenger in Atlantic Culture. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
From London, human rights attorney Philippa Southwell is Managing Director at the Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery Expert Directory. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And from Lagos, Nigeria, award-winning filmmaker Kenneth Gyang, we'll be asking you about your Netflix feature, Olo Touré, a little bit later on. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, it's officially known in France as the National Day of Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition, commemorated on the day that a bill declaring slavery as a crime against humanity was signed into law exactly 20 years ago. Catherine Viette has more.
It was on May 10, 2001, 153 years after France abolished slavery, that it was recognized as a crime against humanity by Parliament. In the Senate, the author of the bill, Christian Taubira, celebrated the historic moment. MP for Guyana, Taubira defended the bill for 2 long years. Since 2006, May 10th is officially the National Day of Memory of the Slave Trade, Slavery, and their abolition.
The Black Code, which has remained in French law for nearly 2 centuries, stipulates that the slave is a piece of furniture. This inscription in the law, this strong, unambiguous word, this official and lasting word, constitutes a symbolic reparation, the first and undoubtedly the most powerful of all.
The law helped usher in a change to school social sciences curricula, placing a greater importance on teaching about slavery and the slave trade. In the 2 decades since the Taubira law was passed, the idea of political and memorial reparations have gained ground in France. Progress welcomed by the former Justice Minister.
This law also created the National Committee for the History and the Memory of Slavery. So it's indeed a moment when France, as a republic, recognised that the monarchy participated in this odious trade, and it acknowledges the necessary status as a crime against humanity.
But the question of financial reparations remains. It's a legal and genealogical minefield that's even divided the various associations of descendants of slaves. The first cases entered the legal system in the early 2000s, but the French courts have so far ruled that it's impossible to figure out the proper amount due for events that happened so long ago.
Grégory Pierrot, your thoughts on what we heard from that bit of archive footage there of Christian Taubira, who talked about this law calling slavery a crime against humanity, a symbolic reparation.
Yes, and necessary one, I believe. I mean, you mentioned, of course, that she comes from Guyana. There's an enormous amount of French people of Caribbean descent for whom this history is still very present. People in metropolitan France may not usually think about it quite the same way, in no small part because for a long time, these aspects of French history were not really taught at school. The Taubira law has made great strides to change this, both in the school curriculum, and in French official memory. But I think many more strides need to be taken.
And we heard some French students complaining that yes, it's on the curriculum, but same as with when it comes to teaching about what happened in Algeria, when it comes to the Paris Commune, they feel as though it gets short shrift. They don't talk about it enough, maybe an hour the whole year.
Yes. There's a real problem, and I know this from many of my friends who teach high school, in teaching anything in high school with the program. So many things have to be taught, and there is so little time. That's generally true. But on this specific topic, I believe part of the issue may have to do with the example that is set by people like our president. On the face of it and on the surface, and because of this law, we have to speak about it. But it's not clear how much we have to speak about it, how much needs to be taught, and from what angle. So I think the bare minimum is what we get at this point. And again, the example that President Macron gave in his speech about Napoleon and in his non-speech today is fairly telling in this sense, right? We will do or pay lip service to memory, but not really go overboard and do the bare minimum.
So why did he give a speech? And in that speech, in fairness to Emmanuel Macron last Wednesday, he said, you know, we're here to commemorate, not to celebrate Napoleon. That's what he said. Why did he speak last Wednesday and he didn't speak this Monday?
Well, I'm going to speculate. But I can speculate. Maybe I will. The contrast, I think, is fairly telling. Again, what I won't speculate on is his personal reasons, but the effect is pretty dire. Last year, when there were no celebrations, of course, for May 10th, President Macron did write a speech that was published, in which he said that the two abolitions of slavery, 1794 and 1848, were the pride and the honor of the French Republic. And then he evoked the imaginary of freedom that linked the abolitions of slavery to the Republic. To me, this begs the question of what then Napoleon is for France. If the freedom, the pride of the Republic is the abolition of slavery, what would you call the person who reestablished slavery? Possibly the shame of France then, but that is not what we got on the 5th of May. And, I'm not going to go into a rhetorical analysis of this speech, but the way he structured it, to me, made very clear how he stands on Napoleon. There, again, lip service was paid to the atrocities, to the tyranny that he represents, to the reestablishment of slavery, all of which was front-loaded. But when he spoke about imaginary in this case, it was to present Napoleon as a sort of military hero, to speak about battles, and more importantly, I think fairly shockingly, to say Napoleon represents when France was conquering the world. I'm not sure what message that's supposed to send to the French youth right now, and how that measures up against this portrayal of the abolition of slavery as the pride of the Republic. Napoleon is presented as a hero, military hero, and the faults that he committed, as President Macron called the reestablishment of slavery, are supposed to somehow and clearly way less than whatever he did that's supposed to be good. I think that is a real problem, especially when, on top of that, you present Napoleon and in his establishment of tyranny after the Republic as sort of a good thing. Right? President Macron said that this sort of form of autocratic regime was good for order and a good follow-up to the Republic. I think all of this is really problematic, and I think it sort of, undermines the idea that his goal was to present a balanced view of Napoleon.
Kenneth Yang, your reaction to the commemorations here, and can I also ask you, how is slavery dealt with on the curriculum when you were a student in Nigeria?
To be honest, slavery wasn't really dealt much, in our curriculum, because if you look at it, I think that the curriculum was largely inspired by our colonizers, the British in this case. So I think that a lot of students aren't really thought much about slavery down here. So the onus is always on people to go out of their way and read about such things. And I think that for me, when you look at how Macron actually sells himself as a friend of Africa, I think he visited almost like 16 countries, and now when it gets to this really important question of how Napoleon is actually being showcased, I think that there are really gray areas for me if I'm going to look at it as a Nigerian.
Gray areas and perhaps an electoral calculus. Philippa Southwell, let me ask you, because we saw there was, during the Black Lives Matter protests of last summer, where you are in the UK, there were statues toppled, most famously that of Bristol-born merchant Edward Colston, which was thrown into the water. Is this a discussion where you are? How slavery is taught in schools? What should be taught about the colonial past?
Well, I think that the UK is leading the way particularly with its modern slavery legislation. So it's very much on our agenda. Incorporating it into our curriculum, I agree, needs to be developed more so that it's a true reflection of what has happened. But the UK has been leading the way with its modern slavery law, its policies to protect victims, current victims of contemporary slavery as well. And that is, it's the biggest human rights issue of our time is contemporary slavery. And it's acknowledging that it still exists very much throughout the world in every country. It's estimated that there are 40 million people currently in modern slavery throughout the world. And so we need to look at the current issues as well. This is by no means is it something of the past. And we need to look at why do we still have slavery throughout the UK and throughout the rest of the world? And what can we do as a society to eradicate it?
And when you look at the ceremony that took place in Paris this Monday, your thoughts on, is it too much about the past?
Well, I think we need to learn from the past. It's not something that we can just put under the carpet. We need to teach and reflect on what's happened in history, not sugarcoating our perception of what happened. And I think that we should learn from our mistakes, and that should hone and develop how we move forward globally in relation to exploitation of individuals who are in a position of vulnerability, looking at all of the nuances that are attached to slavery exploitation, because, again, it is a current issue as well as a historic one.
Gregory Pierrot, let me ask you, where you're sitting now in the United States, is the discussion when it comes to slavery about how to stop modern-day slavery, which, by the way, we'll be talking about more in part 2 of our discussion, or is it about this issue of reparations, compensation for the descendants of freed slaves?
I mean, it always depends who you're talking to and in what context. I believe both topics are very much on people's minds. The issue of reparations, of course, is much closer to people here. The presence of that past is in many ways much more immediate in the U.S. The problem in France, at least the easy way to push this away, tends to be because metropolitan France, also we are led to think, saw very little of slavery, and most of it happened in the overseas colonies. So it's easy to not talk about it. In the U.S., it's much harder, and that memory is present notably through statues we've talked about a lot, but also in institutions, right? People who made money off of slavery, banks who made money, insurance companies, all of which, mind you, are also present in France, right? A database was just released in France that lists all the people who profited after the abolition of slavery, who got money off the abolition of slavery, former slave owners, different institutions. And in this way, I believe the information is spreading that may take the conversation in France to a similar place where it is in the U.S., where indeed, reparations are very much is very much the current question.
And Kenneth Gyang, when you talk about slavery in Nigeria, is it about again the past, And when you talk about the past, is it simply the Europeans who came and took human beings away to other parts of the world, or is it also about the slavery that existed well before those Europeans even arrived?
No, I think like when slavery is discussed in Nigeria, it's always from the point of view of Europeans coming in to come and take people from Nigeria. And so for me, that is always the basis of the conversation that we have. But I think that, I mean, there's been lots of research about how there's always been, a form of slavery that actually existed before the coming of Europeans. And that for me is how that for me is actually a subject that should be carefully looked at. But for the time being, we always just talk about slavery in the past, and we don't even talk about modern slavery as it is.
And we will when we come back, just after a quick break. How do you stop slavery, which exists still in 2021? Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate on the day that France commemorates the abolition of slavery and the day in which a bill was signed into law 20 years ago today, making it a crime against humanity in this country. We're talking with Grégory Pierrot from Stamford, Connecticut, Associate Professor of English at the University of Connecticut, author of The Black Avenger in Atlantic Culture. From London, we're with human rights attorney Philippa Southwell, Managing Director at the Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery Experts Directory. And from Lagos, Nigeria, award-winning filmmaker Kenneth Gyang. You'll recall that back in 2017, the whole world was shocked by those images of sub-Saharan Africans sold at slave market. In enslavement, this was in Libya. Enslavement, which comes in many forms. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, in its 2020 report on human trafficking, breaking down why people are bought and sold. And you can see from this graph, it's everything from forced marriages to forced labor. But with, as we can see in this chart, sexual exploitation, the number one reason for human trafficking today. In Oloture, the feature film that's on Netflix, Kenneth Gyang tells the real-life story of Nigerian investigative reporter Tobore Ovurie, who went undercover to expose sex trafficking rings.
As long as you know that this is not the real you and you are only undercover.
Get one woman where they carry people go Europe.
You know waiting with the call Forza Speciale.
Let's be that.
Avoid them face in case we go stealing them.
You're of the story.
It is now my story.
But this one will get small wahala.
Once we reach Europe, we'll fit send better money comes.
We will come and get you.
There is so much more to the story that needs to be told. So many people that need to be brought down.
Kenneth Gyang, what inspired you to bring that story to the screen?
I mean, for me personally, I travel a lot. I attend film labs and I go to international film festivals. And so anytime I travel around Europe, I actually get to meet, to see some of these sisters from West Africa and especially from Nigeria who are on the streets of Europe. And so I know for sure that in 2017, for instance, I was at this airport in Addis Ababa and I met this young Nigerian girl who was going to India, and she doesn't even understand what a boarding gate is and how she was actually going to leave Addis Ababa to get to India. And so for me, all of these, occurrences actually inspired me to start working on a film like that. And so I was already developing something at the Yahweh Producers Workshop, but then we talked with the executive producer of Emmanuel Films, which is Mo Abudu, and so she told me about this film that she wants to make. And because I was already working on a similar project like that, and I feel really strongly about the subject based on what I always encounter myself in on the streets of Europe. So I decided to just take this head on and make it a very, very personal film and present it in such a way that it's almost as realistic as you can get, instead of just trying to play around the glamour of the sex industry. I just wanted to be in a form of a verite, if you like. Yeah.
So you have people who are desperate for a better life, who get promised, streets paved with gold or whatever, and the enslavement begins long before they reach Europe or other parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, thing is that before you actually take some of these young women to the streets of Europe, you have to put them through a certain tradition, if you like. And that is like how you need to take them to maybe shrines to go and swear to gods that they are not going to run away. And basically, that is one aspect. Another aspect is to even try to record some of these victims, naked, and you threaten them that if anything happens, you're going to release it on social media and all of that. So yes, the enslavement actually starts way before then. But if you go back again, you're still going to start tracking it down to that whole set for better life, based on the fact that the economic situation around their communities are a bit tough. So that enslavement to capitalism, if you like, and because of the whole way that the economy is really tough on people, is actually a form of enslavement before you go all the way down, and it makes them very vulnerable to be recruited. So yeah, it actually starts way before they get to the streets of Europe.
Philippa Southwell, what can be done?
To eradicate modern slavery, I think that as much as we would all like to eradicate it, it is an organised crime, and I think that it will always exist, sadly. We must be better at identifying victims of human trafficking and modern slavery, and that's by training frontline professionals. So that's lawyers, law enforcement, the courts, medical practitioners, all those that may encounter victims of trafficking. And that's just the front-facing types of exploitation. Modern slavery affects all of us and touches almost every item that we use on a daily basis.
But
for example, there is a huge...
I was going to say, you heard Kenneth talk about, he goes to film festivals, he goes to workshops around the world, and he sees his fellow countrywomen on the streets. What could be done specifically to help the plight of these women?
I think there needs to be better social support for victims who, one of the control mechanisms for these young vulnerable women is that they are in a position of vulnerability. So they can be preyed upon by traffickers, by exploiters, with a promise of a better life. Many of these women are in very, very desperate situations and are coming to other countries with the promise of a better life and that they can support their families. There needs to be a better understanding of why these women are in this position. More support needs to be given to women who are vulnerable so that they don't enter into that exploitative situation where they are trafficked throughout the world, throughout Europe, in sexual exploitation. Many victims who are sexually exploited may go on to commit forced criminality offences, which are intrinsically linked to their exploitation as well. So it's all about looking at how do we support victims coming from their home countries? What is the issue that's going wrong there? Why are they vulnerable? What can we do to support these women better?
Are you suggesting like public awareness campaigns inside the countries they come from?
I am suggesting that. We encounter victims of modern slavery probably on a daily basis. Modern slavery has many forms. It's not just sexual exploitation. There's forced criminality, forced labour. There's, most of the items that we touch have some form of forced labour exploitation in the supply chain. And so it's about public awareness. It's boycotting brands, for example, that have forced labour in their supply chain. We're at a stage in history where big corporations need to take responsibility for unethical supply chains. And the way that we do that is by consumer boycotting. And we've seen that historically with many, many test cases. You choose where you buy your garments, your fruit, your vegetables, your mobile phones, for example. Most mobile phones have metals in them that are used in mines where they use forced child labour. And so we collectively can advance change as a general public simply by where we do or don't purchase various items. And I think that, it's not just organised criminal networks that are perpetrating exploitation or that have some culpability and legal culpability. Big companies have unethical supply chains. And by consumer boycotts, when their profit costs go down because people aren't buying their product, that will make them stand up and listen and take this issue seriously. I mean, we have in the UK legislation, modern slavery compliance legislation, and other countries, the US, Canada, Australia, have implemented similar legislation where we are forcing corporations to act. And I think that there will always be organised criminal networks, and I think it's naive and idealistic to suggest that will never be the case. Where we can advance change is by targeting corporations and eliminating slavery and regulating certain industries where we know exploitation takes place. And I think that's where we can advance change, if we are penalising and prosecuting, whether it's civil liability or criminal liabilities, that we are actioning against big corporations. And I think that's where we can measure change.
Gregory Pierrot, sitting in the United States, how much do you feel that consumer power that Philippa is talking about could change the world for the better? We've seen, for instance, that when it came to forced labor being used in China, in Xinjiang province, that initial calls by corporations came up against blowback from the Chinese, and they backed off to a degree. We don't know whether or not there'll be a boycott of the Olympics that are due to take place, the Winter Olympics in China, in 3 years' time. Your thoughts on how strong is consumer power today?
So I think my personal belief, I think probably backed by history here, is that consumer pressure can lead to institutional measures. And I think, to me, that's the extent that there's symbolic pressure here that can be hard to measure. But I believe shaming companies and potentially governments can lead other governments to take the measures that will, or that might more directly push companies to change, as Philippa was talking about. There are examples historically of major boycott movements. The Saccharites in England at the turn of the 19th century were also trying to oppose the sugar production by the enslaved. I think, sort of like recycling, I personally think it may be difficult to measure exactly what difference this kind of individual, singular, popular opposition can make. But I believe the symbolic pressure is important and has proven instrumental in history to actually push for more institutional measures.
Kenneth Young, your thoughts on what you heard from Philippa there about the idea of raising public awareness? I know in Nigeria, a lot of those women who find themselves caught in sex trafficking rings come from Edo State. Can something be done, or is something being done on that score?
Yeah, we have the agency called NAPTIP in Nigeria that is saddled with the responsibility of trying to help these young women and try to do a lot of sensitization, events around Edo State. So And I know that a lot of international donor agencies as well have been trying to work. But what I'm actually just what curious about though is the fact that I've had some conversations with donor agencies who really want to help, and so we discuss if the Nordic model is going to work, and for me personally in Africa, I don't know if that is going to be possible. You know, the art of decriminalizing, sex workers and punishing those who are buying it. And they say it's like incredibly working in the Scandinavian countries. But for me, I think that there are lots of ways that we can think about that, because sensitization, yes, that's fine. But then you have to just look at it, that the fact that these women from their communities are really under pressure and they're really working to make sure they defend for their families. So sensitization is okay, but something needs to be done as well in terms of their economic well-being in some of these communities.
And are things changing? Because that is a permanent conversation we have here in France over whether you decriminalize the sex workers more and criminalize more their customers. I mean,
things for me, I think that the publicity for me is almost like a drop. Just a drop in the ocean, because when Oloture came out, it was really massively received in Nigeria in terms of conversations around human trafficking. And so there's actually a hemorrhage about discussing, the economy of the country as well, because some of the people who watch the film were saying that you really have to be extremely poor for you to actually pay money in order to get trafficked, because that's actually what happened with some of these young women here. So I think that publicity is not really at the level that it should be, and in terms of sensitization, but I think, we need to just think about it, and more needs to be done.
Well, let me turn to the lawyer here. Philippa Southwell, it brings us to an important question, which is, in 2021, what is the definition of slavery?
Well, one of the misconceptions in relation to slavery is that there needs to be cross-border movement. That's not the case. There needs to be the act, the means, and the purpose. So somebody may be exploited, for example, forced labour, forced criminality, domestic servitude. There's many different types of exploitation. So the act, the means, and the purpose. And again, an individual does not need to move through borders to be trafficked. In the United Kingdom, we have a huge problem with British national children being moved from county to county. So there's the transportation element, but they are not moving out of the jurisdiction, and that is not a limb of the definition. And so we see different types of exploitation evolve, and I see on sort of an annually basis victims being exploited in different ways as the modus operandi of criminal networks or individuals adapt. So, for example, with forced criminality, we have victims who are involved in all sorts of criminal offences in the UK, whether it's cannabis production, whether it's drug running, weapons running. Many victims as well, if we are going back to the prostitution and the forced sexual exploitation. Many victims here are trafficked for sexual exploitation, but they graduate onto a more controlling position within that ring. So they will show the younger girls what to do. They may incite prostitution. And those cases are very complex because we are prosecuting and convicting these women who are still under the control of their exploiter. And they become essentially alpha victims, which is what the prosecution like to call them here. And these cases are extremely complex, both to defend and prosecute, because trafficking and exploitation and modern slavery, it can last many, many years. I've had victims that have been enslaved for 20, 30 years, and they become embedded into that lifestyle. And it's down to understanding the nuances and the control mechanisms of how individuals are exploited, particularly within our legal system and our criminal legal system here and many throughout the world, is that we deal with that evidence and tangible evidence. Trafficking is unique in the sense that the control mechanisms are invisible. So when we think about historic slavery, we think about chains. There are no chains in modern slavery. The control mechanisms are ritual oaths, they are debt, they are violence. There's many types of control mechanisms used. And that's why these cases are very difficult to identify because of this psychological, invisible control mechanism.
And the trend, as you say, is towards pushing people towards criminality. Grégory Pierrot, here in France, once again, it's political. On this National Remembrance Day, which comes basically a year before another presidential election, there was a statement put out by one of the frontrunners, the far-right leader Marine Le Pen. She's saying the human trafficking organized by smugglers in the Mediterranean and encouraged under, quote, a humanism that has been subverted by NGOs financed by the European Union to participate in this modern slavery. Basically, it's people smugglers in the Mediterranean. Your thoughts on how this whole conversation, and this is touches a little bit on the topic of your book, on how people are perceived, this conversation on modern slavery, how's it going to go as we head towards that presidential election?
You mentioned Marine Le Pen, whose party has roots in French fascism, who has links to companies and dictators around the world. So I wouldn't pay much heed to anything she says on any topic, especially not slavery. It's convenient for her to make that argument and avoid talking about French companies may be involved, as Philippa mentioned, that offers of slavery that are of concern directly to French interests that she avoids speaking of, as is our wont. As to the topic of slavery and the memory of slavery, I think the obvious way in which it will play, and already is playing in the campaign for the elections next year, is that it has become a cultural argument. In the opening of his speech on Napoleon on the 5th, President Macron sort of gestured or mentioned a sort of vague group of people that supposedly want to erase history and shape the past in the way they see the present. This has been a refrain from the government in the past few months, and notably by way of the ministers of education, who have targeted French scholars, usually of African descent, or the African diaspora, and interested in the memory of slavery and other topics related to race. And have tried to silence them. I don't think we've ever seen this in French history, ministers of education threatening researchers in France. But this has become a trendy, and as has been another trend for the past 3 decades or so, we see President Macron sort of try to seduce the electorate of the far right with far right arguments. And I think everybody expects this to be the battleground for the 2022 elections.
But in fairness, he has tried to start the conversation with that commission on what happened during the Rwandan genocide, on what happened during the colonial era in Algeria. He hasn't just pandered to the far right.
Yeah, I would say he has mostly pandered to the far right, at least lately. And I think it's cheap, quite literally. It's a lot of talk. Not much has been done except to, again, threaten researchers with rules that might prevent them from during their work. The cost is minimal, I would say, and the publicity is maximal. Everybody's talking about it. It makes him look strong to not much cost. I do believe the dividends of this kind of policy are, if any, are immediate, and I think that is the point. The next deadline is the election, and I think this contributes in making him look like a strong man. The essence of the speech about Napoleon was on the same lines. Everybody expects Macron to face Le Pen in the second round, and so this is the ground he has decided to fight her on. I personally do not believe that's the best choice, but I'm not running for president, I guess.
Okay, Grégory Pierrot, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Stamford, Connecticut. I want to thank Philippa Southwell in London, Kenneth Giang in Lagos. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.